This is the story of how one of the most successful recording artists in American history ended up in a federal bankruptcy court with $1,000 in cash, facing a debt that had climbed past $10 million. And the bulk of that debt wasn't money she spent carelessly or hid offshore. Penalties and interest had converted a mismanaged tax situation into a number so large that even the IRS, at one point, couldn't fully account for it. Dionne Warwick, the United States Treasury, and what the tax code does when it catches up with you after years of compounding silence. That is what this video covers. East Orange, New Jersey, December 12, 1940. That's where this story starts. Marie Dionne Warwick came into a family that didn't just appreciate music, they lived inside it. Her mother, Lee Drinkard Warwick, managed a gospel group called the Drinkard Singers, while her father, Mansell Warwick, started out as a Pullman porter, worked his way into gospel record promotion, and eventually trained as a certified public accountant, which, given everything that would follow, stands as one of the more biting ironies in this entire story. Sister Dee Dee Warwick would go on to chart in R&B, maternal aunt Cissy Houston would raise a daughter named Whitney, and cousin Leontine Price would become one of opera's most celebrated sopranos. This family didn't hover at the edges of American music. They occupied the center of it, and Dionne was about to step all the way in. The name Warwick itself came from a mistake, which turns out to be a thread woven through this whole story. Her birth surname was Warwick, Warrick, and when Scepter Records pressed her debut single in November of 1962, someone at the label misspelled it. Warwick became Warrick, and rather than fight the error, she adopted it permanently. That debut single, Don't Make Me Over, climbed to number 21 on the Billboard Hot 100 and introduced the world to a partnership that would define a decade of American pop. Warwick, alongside composer Burt Bacharach and lyricist Hal David. What followed over the next 9 years was one of the most sustained runs in pop history. Walk On By, I Say a Little Prayer, Do You Know the Way to San Jose, which earned her first Grammy, Valley of the Dolls, spending 4 weeks at number 2, I'll Never Fall in Love Again, and more than 30 charting singles on Scepter alone. By the close of the 1960s, Warwick wasn't simply a famous singer. Her name carried weight regardless of what played on the radio that week. The Bacharach and David collaboration unraveled in 1971, and it unraveled badly. Lawsuits, fractured relationships, and a split that would take years to legally resolve. Warner Brothers signed her that same year under a contract reportedly worth $5 million, described at the time as the most lucrative ever offered to a female vocalist. But the mid-70s proved commercially difficult, and the hits that had arrived so naturally with Bacharach and David stopped flowing with the same regularity. During this period, on the advice of astrologer and numerologist Linda Goodman, author of the best-selling book Sun Signs, she added an E to her name and spent several years recording as Dionne Warwick, before dropping it around 1975 and returning to Warwick for good. A fresh start arrived through Clive Davis at Arista Records, and producer Barry Manilow took her into the studio to record an album simply called Dionne, her first United States platinum record. That same year, Grammy Awards came for both pop and R&B female vocal performance, making her the first woman in history to claim both categories in the same year. The second major chapter of her career opened with real force, and that's when the numbers started getting genuinely large. 1985 brought the song that would define an era, and it arrived as a charity record. That's What Friends Are For featured Warwick alongside Elton John, Gladys Knight, and Stevie Wonder, with all proceeds directed to AMFAR, the American Foundation for AIDS Research. 4 weeks at number 1 on the Hot 100 followed, along with more than $3 million raised for the cause, and the record cemented something beyond chart performance. Warwick became a cultural figure whose significance extended well past the music itself, and the industry recognized it. 56 charted singles on the Billboard Hot 100 sat behind her by the mid-1980s, 5 competitive Grammys had been collected, and publicists described career sales exceeding 100 million records worldwide. A fan base stretching across continents and generations supported her. Business managers handled her finances. And that is precisely where the story turns. What her publicist and attorney would describe years later was a period of financial mismanagement stretching from the late 1980s through the mid-1990s. A window during which the people she had hired to handle her money were, in her camp's words, failing to do so with negligence that compounded quietly across years. The Internal Revenue Service identified 9 tax years, 1991 through 1999, during which federal taxes hadn't been properly addressed, and the figure attached to those years eventually grew to nearly $7 million. The California Franchise Tax Board separately pursued more than $3 million in state business taxes. Publicist Kevin Sasaki released a statement that addressed the situation directly. Due to several consecutive years, the late 1980s through the mid-1990s, of negligent and gross financial mismanagement, Dionne Warwick has realized the current necessity to file personal bankruptcy. The statement then added the sentence that reframes the entire story. Although the actual amount of back taxes owed has been paid, the resulting penalties and interest has continually accrued. Read that carefully, because it changes the shape of everything. The actual taxes had been paid. What mushroomed into $10 million was the consequence of payments arriving late, being rejected, or being consumed by the accumulating cost of years without resolution. Attorney Daniel Schultz put it plainly. Ms. Warrick had a business manager who mismanaged her affairs. Before she knew it, she owed $1 gazillion in taxes. She's actually paid more than the face amount of the taxes, but with all of the crazy interest and penalties that they add, the number kept mushrooming. Roughly $1,300,000 had gone toward the debt over the years, and none of it had meaningfully reduced the total because interest and penalties kept pace with every payment. Repayment proposals to both the IRS and the California Franchise Tax Board had been submitted multiple times, and each rejection meant more time passed, which meant more interest, which meant the number climbed further, which made settlement harder still. By 2009, the IRS filed a federal tax lien against her for approximately $2.2 million, covering back taxes from the 1990s, and that filing became public record. The kind of document that follows a person, limits their financial options, and signals to the world that the government holds a formal claim against their assets. And then, in May of 2012, the IRS revoked $1.2 million of that very lien. An accounting error, the agency acknowledged. More than half the claim had been wrong, and 3 years had passed before anyone caught it. Schultz went further, telling local press that the IRS had lost her file entirely at one point, for several years, meaning the agency had been pursuing a debt it couldn't properly document during a stretch that mattered. None of that erased the underlying liability, but it substantially complicates the version of this story where a reckless celebrity simply refused to pay her taxes. What court records and attorney statements actually reflect is a tax situation that cascaded through administrative failure, managerial negligence, and the compounding machinery of federal penalties, until the number exceeded $10 million, with the IRS itself having overstated it by more than $1 million along the way. Throughout all of this, Warrick kept working, and that detail deserves attention. During the early 1990s, while those tax years accumulated, she took on a high-profile hosting role with the Psychic Friends Network, an infomercial operation offering psychic readings by phone that ran for hours on cable television. Years later, addressing the gig without apology, her words were, "Look, it was a job. Recordings weren't happening, and I had to feed my family and keep a roof over my head." The parent company, Information Communications, filed for Chapter 11 in February of 1998, carrying $26 million in liabilities. But Warrick had functioned as a paid spokesperson rather than an equity owner, and no reliable reporting connects her to personal financial losses from that collapse. By 2007, Her name appeared on California's list of the top 500 delinquent taxpayers. By 2012, a corrected but still substantial federal lien remained active. And by early 2013, her attorney concluded there was no path forward that didn't run directly through bankruptcy court. March 17, 2013. Warrick completed the credit counseling that federal law requires before a bankruptcy petition can be filed, and 4 days later, on March 21st, the first full day of spring, she filed for Chapter 7 protection in the United States Bankruptcy Court for the District of New Jersey Newark Vicinage. The numbers in that filing deserve to be read slowly. Total assets, $25,500. Total liabilities, $10,727,429.91. Sitting on the assets side were $1,000 in cash, 2 fur coats and 2 pairs of diamond earrings valued together at $13,000, $5,000 in artwork, $5,000 in clothing, some furniture, and a SAG-AFTRA pension listed as exempt. No real estate appeared anywhere on the list, because the South Orange, New Jersey home she occupied carried a monthly rent of approximately $5,000. She didn't own it. On the liabilities side, $6,964,466.87 owed to the IRS for tax years 1991 through 1999. More than $3 million owed to the California Franchise Tax Board, roughly $500,000 owed to a former business manager and attorney, and about $20,000 on a Visa credit card. Monthly income ran to $20,950, while monthly expenses totaled $20,940. $10 a month. That's what remained for one of the most celebrated recording artists in American history. Reporters gathered outside her home when the filing became public, and Warrick closed the door on the microphone extended toward her. Everything communicated publicly came through Schultz and Sasaki. Schultz spoke to multiple outlets with a candor that cut through the celebrity bankruptcy framing and landed somewhere more uncomfortable. Just because someone is a well-known prominent celebrity doesn't mean they're conversant in their financial affairs. They rely heavily on people and frequently wind up waking up someday saying, "Geez, how did I get in this mess, and how do I get out of it?" He also described the debt as something that had started small in the 90s and simply never stopped growing. And on the dischargeability question, his legal argument arrived plainly. The taxes are of an age where, under the bankruptcy code, they're dischargeable taxes. That argument would drive years of courtroom fighting. The IRS didn't accept the filing and walked away. Chapter 7. Bankruptcy can eliminate certain tax debts when those debts are old enough and returns were filed on time. But the agency disputed whether Warrick's situation met those standards, and adversarial proceedings followed targeting 2 entities connected to her finances. Stargirl Productions Incorporated, a booking operation based in Culver City, California, and KMBA Productions. Both came under scrutiny as the IRS worked to determine whether income flowing through them affected the dischargeability question. March of 2014 brought a trustee motion to formally excuse Warrick from the $10 million bill and allow her to retain her listed property, with Schultz telling the Wall Street Journal that only roughly $25,000 of the total debt would qualify as non-dischargeable under his reading of the code. The IRS kept contesting, and a trial date eventually landed on March 6, 2019, nearly 6 years after the original filing. The federal government shutdown, which ran 35 days before ending in late January of that year, forced a postponement. And then, in the fall of 2019, both the IRS lawsuit and Warrick's countersuit were dismissed by mutual stipulation. Both sides agreed to end it. The financial terms of that resolution were never disclosed. What Warrick did during those 6 years of litigation is, depending on your perspective, beside the point or the entire point. Recording continued, touring continued, and television appearances accumulated alongside multiple album releases. A 2021 documentary about her life, titled after her debut single Don't Make Me Over, produced the single most quoted line of her commentary on the whole affair. Why can General Motors declare bankruptcy but not Dionne Warwick? General Motors had filed for Chapter 11 protection in June of 2009, eliminating $60 billion in debt with direct government assistance. The same government simultaneously pursuing Warwick over 90s-era tax liability. Warwick never claimed she owed nothing, and her own attorney acknowledged a real liability existed. But the specific composition of that liability, what was original principal, what was accumulated interest, what was penalty, and who bore responsibility for the situation compounding across decades, the public record never fully resolved. The year the IRS litigation ended, 2019, also delivered a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award, and the timing registered with anyone paying attention. December of 2023 brought Kennedy Center Honors in Washington. On October 11, 2024, East Orange, New Jersey, her birthplace, renamed a street Dionne Warwick Way. 8 days later, on October 19, 2024, she walked into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony in Cleveland at 83 years old, and on the red carpet beforehand, asked how it felt. Her answer covered 4 words. It's about time, is it not? Inside the ceremony, she kept it equally brief. I'm so pleased to be here. I'm just going to say this and get off the stage. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Current estimates of her net worth cluster between $300,000 and $500,000, a fraction of what it once represented, and performing continues regardless. May of 2026, at 85 years old and following recovery from emergency leg surgery, she publicly described as driven by pain that was, in her own words, unbearable, Warwick returned to the stage at Atlanta Symphony Hall. So what does all of this actually mean? Taken together. Extraordinary money had moved through Warwick's career across 6 decades, reportedly $3 million per year during the Psychic Friends years alone, a $5 million recording contract in the 70s, settlement proceeds, royalties, and touring income accumulating across generations of fans. None of that prevented the bankruptcy filing from listing $20,000 on a credit card, a rented house, and 2 fur coats among her most valuable possessions. The catastrophe wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, administrative, and slow-moving, which in certain ways makes it more unsettling than a sudden collapse. Business managers made decisions or failed to make them. Tax years went unaddressed, repayment proposals were rejected, and the penalties and interest structure of federal tax law transformed a manageable liability into one that exceeded $10 million before anyone forced a reckoning. Schultz captured the human mechanics of it plainly. People who are genuinely gifted at one thing, in her case, making music, often hand over complete control of everything else to people they trust, and sometimes that trust lands catastrophically. The IRS's own conduct in this case also belongs in the story. A lien filed for $2.2 million, with $1.2 million later revoked as an accounting error. A file the agency reportedly lost for years. A decade of litigation that was resolved not through a verdict, but through both parties agreeing to walk away, with terms no one made public. Dionne Warwick was born in 1940 and cut her first record in 1962. And more than 60 years of performing followed. 5 competitive Grammy Awards, a Lifetime Achievement Grammy, Kennedy Center Honors, and a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction. A street in East Orange bears her name. The last line of the IRS story, after a decade of litigation over $10 million in penalties and interest, came when 2 sides chose to end it quietly, with terms sealed from the public. At 85, she returned to the stage. That is the whole story. Subscribe to Backstage Hollywood and hit the bell. We cover the financial stories behind Hollywood's biggest names every week, and let us know in the comment which celebrity financial downfall you want to hear next.